Sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name is Beth, and if you're new, welcome. Today's block is a very scrappy block using half square triangles and then some leftover strips, or they're sometimes called strings in the quilting world. I'm going to sew those together to make the center and some half square triangles. To make the half square triangles, I'm using some squares. I need 10 half square triangles, so I have 5 4-inch squares of the print and 5 of the background, and then I need 2 3.5-inch squares for 2 of the corners of this quilt block. So the first thing I did was I pulled out my scraps and I started sewing all of those strings together using a 1/4-inch seam. They're not all perfectly straight on the edge. I just had to make sure that, of course, the raw edges were inside of the seam. And my squares, the center square for this quilt block is 6.5 inches. So I just had to make sure that my strips or strings here were at least 6.5 inches long. And this one that I'm putting together right now is one of my favorites. I think it's an old piece of fabric, a vintage piece of fabric, and it has all those beautiful colors that I'm trying to incorporate in this quilt. So I'll keep putting these strips together until my little piece of fabric that I'm sewing together gets to be at least 6.5 inches wide. So I pressed my fabric. After getting all of those strips together, I measured and found that it wasn't quite 6.5 inches, so I added one more strip on the side, a larger one, so I'll have to cut that down. And here's this nice stripe. It was actually a sheet in its prior life. I used it for a backing for a quilt a while back, and it was in my basket of strings or strips, and I'm going to add it to the side right here so that my little piece of fabric will grow to a little bit bigger than 6.5 inches. After everything was pressed, I took a square ruler and I cut a square 6.5 by 6.5. It's time to make those half square triangles, and these squares are about 4.25 inches. I could have used 4 inches, and I would have cut it pretty close because I'm going to be trimming these down to 3.5 inches, but a lot of these squares were already cut. I have little drawers full of different size squares, and one of the drawers is my 4-inch drawer, and not everything in there is perfectly 4 inches. Some of these were a little bit bigger, so I am going to put one of those prints with the background fabric, and then I'll be sewing on both sides of the pencil line. And after I put my seam in, my 2 seams in, I'll cut along the pencil line. I'll press the half square triangles open, and then I'll trim them all to 3.5 inches. Now I have all of the elements I need for my quilt block. I have the 6.5 inch square made with strips, and now I'll place all those half square triangles around the center square. I've got 2 on opposite corners pointing at each other, and then the other half square triangles will kind of follow suit and go in the same direction. They're all sort of, each group is pointing at the other group. And then I have 2 little corners to cover with my 3.5 inch square. After getting that top row piece together, I went to each side of the square here and I put those 2 half square triangles together, and then after I get the 2 together, I'll join them to the center square, and then I'll do the bottom row and then put it all together, and before you know it, I'll have this quilt block complete. I have enough blue scraps with some greens and browns to make a beautiful quilt. I'm going to keep sewing these together, and before you know it, I will have a quilt to give away. Today I'm going to try and take these 16 quilt blocks that I made a week or so ago. I'll leave a link below. I'm going to try to turn them into a quilt top. Now, I could have put them all together, but after having 4 pieced together, I thought it looked kind of nice. Maybe I would divide sets of 4 blocks with some sashing and cornerstones. So the first thing I did is I put 4 of my quilt blocks together. After getting 4 sets of 4 quilt blocks sewn together, I laid them out on my floor and I tested out some different cornerstones, and I decided I would make some snowballs for the cornerstones of my quilt. So I pulled out a bag of my blue scraps and I cut, I think it was 9 3.5-inch squares to make some snowballs. After getting my 9 squares cut, then I had to find out how big I was going to make those squares for the corners of these blocks to make them into snowball quilt blocks. And I am using 1.5-inch squares, so I need 4 squares for each of my 3.5-inch squares to turn them into these really cute little snowball quilt blocks. So I took my little squares and I did some chain piecing. I put one little 1.5-inch square in each corner of my larger blue squares, and I put a seam in from corner to corner. I did not draw a line, but of course you could draw a pencil line if you feel more comfortable with that. I did mine just by eyeballing from corner to corner, and since this is such a small little square, it worked out just fine. After getting all of those squares sewn on the corners, I trimmed away the excess, and I won't be saving these little tiny pieces. I save a lot of tiny pieces, but these are probably too tiny for my liking. And I just went ahead and trimmed all of those triangles off of the corners, and then I pressed these little snowball blocks. Placed my little snowballs in all the corners of my larger groups of 4, and now all I need to do is cut some strips, and my strips are 24.5 inches by 3.5 inches, and I needed 12 strips to go all the way around my larger groupings of 4. So I'm going to work in rows, and the first row will be 3 snowballs and 2 strips, and I'll work in rows, and then I'll put those rows together. My quilt top is now all ready to go, and if I wanted to make a twin size, I would just make 2 more sets of those 4 quilt blocks together. My quilt top right now is about 57 by 57, and I'm going to leave it as is. I'm not sure who this is going to, and if I decide it needs to be twin size, I'll just need to make a few more blocks, and that'll be easy to do. I have a nice big stack of some older Christmas fabric here today, and I'm going to be making a very simple Christmas quilt using some 3-inch strips. And here is my alternate fabric. I'm going to be using this snowflake fabric in every other square. The first thing I did was I took all of my fabric and I cut 1 3-inch strip from each of 13 different prints. I'm going to be sewing some groups of strips together. I'm putting my squares on point, which is a little bit tricky for me to think about ahead of time or to plan. So I'm going to make some groups of strips. This first one, I'll make a set of 3 strips together, and I want the edge of my quilt to be that cream fabric. So this group of strips will be a cream and a print and a cream. This is the only set that I am making using 3 strips. The other groups of strips that I'll be sewing together will be groups of 4. And I had all of my strip sets together, sewn together. Like I said, most of these are groups of 4. I took them to my ironing board and I'm going to press all of them towards the darker fabric using just a little bit of water in a spray bottle. And typically I will start pressing from the back and getting those seams to go towards the darker fabric, and then I'll flip it over and just give it one last press on the top. Now that I have all my strips put together, I will be cutting them all into 3-inch segments. Not all of those strips were 40 or 42 inches, so I did have a few pieces left over that are sets of 2 and 3 that I'll be slipping into my quilt once I have all of my pieces ready to go. I'm beginning on my design wall, but I will be moving to the floor. I thought it might be easier for me and you to figure out how to begin laying this quilt out. So I need a cream square on the top of every strip, and all of the strips are going to be sewn together diagonally. And just to let you know, this quilt top will end up with squares all the way around, and after it's quilted, that is when I will cut off the triangles and give this quilt a straight edge. It's a little bit easier than having all of those bias edges. I could cut triangles off and straighten the edge of the quilt before it's quilted, but I think it's better to wait so that I don't have all those bias edges. So I'm just arranging the strips so that there is a cream square all the way around my quilt top. Had an idea of where I was going with this quilt and with all these pieces. I did move everything to the floor, and I'm going to be finding out if I have enough of all these little strip sets or sets of 4 and 3s to make a quilt. And I did. I had just enough of these little squares to make a nice size quilt. My quilt top ended up to be about 50 by 54 inches. When I had used up all of my little sets of squares, there were only a few places, like right here you can see a couple of blanks where I need to put a cream square, and over here there were a couple of areas where again I need to add another square, and at the bottom I think I needed a set of 2 in a couple of places. So it's helpful for me to just lay it out. I didn't do any planning with paper and pencil. To me, this is a little bit more fun just to play with the squares and the quilt itself. When I had it all laid out, I was able to start sewing these diagonal rows together. Now, if you were to plan this quilt with paper and pencil, you would begin with 1 square in the corner, the next row is 3, and the next row is 5, and every row you add 2 squares. So when you get the quilt as big as you want, you just sort of start decreasing by 2, and that's how I put this quilt together. So I began with that corner square, one of the corner squares, and I added it to the set of 3 and then the set of 5. And I just went along like that halfway through the quilt, and then I had to start decreasing. But it's sometimes just a little bit tricky to see how it fits together, especially as the rows get longer. But it's helpful for me to have it there on the floor. I'm thankful that my floor is big enough for this nice sized quilt. As I started out putting the quilt together, I did not pin at all of the seams. Sometimes I pin, but these were coming together really well, and since I had pressed towards the darker fabric, I just kind of had to remind the seams which way to go when I got to each seam there, and it came together really well. I started pinning when my long strips of squares were a bit longer, and that just made it go a little easier. Even though these fabrics are a bit old and dated, I just think this quilt turned out so pretty with those reds and greens and just a little bit of blue. And I am going to hang this up. Maybe one of the children will want a new Christmas quilt this year, and I'm going to wait and see if somebody likes it in the family. And if they do, of course, I'm going to get it quilted up, and this will be a great Christmas gift to give away this year. Today I want to work with some pieces that were given to me, sort of a hand-me-down from one of my YouTube friends. I received some stacks of these pieces from a quilt that someone had not quite completed, and it was a bit of a mystery to me how I was going to put them together. There was a stack with like this one with all different colors. There was the stack at the bottom with the light colors on each end, one stack with the light color in the middle, and then of course that stack with the light colored strips, the cream and white strips. So I tried to puzzle this quilt together, trying to figure out where the pieces were intended to go, and I had to make a decision. So since most of the stacks, the 4 stacks, were very even, for example, the one I'm putting out here only uses one of the strips with the white centerpiece, and then it uses 2 of the other strips, and then it does not use the strip that has all of the different colors. So I could have made a quilt using these pieces. The quilt blocks would look like that. I moved things around quite a bit before filming, trying to decide how I was going to put this quilt together. Rather than making blocks, I also lined up that quilt block using, instead of 5 pieces, there's sort of that 5th piece is between each of the blocks, sort of making a column. So that was one way, but I ended up with this cross shape, and the design appealed to me, and so that is the one that I'll be putting together today. This design will be made in a row form. Rather than making blocks, I'm going to sew them all together in rows, beginning with a strip that has all different colors. The next strip has that white square in the center, and the middle strip has that long strip with the cream color, and then I used another strip with the colorful piece. And instead of making blocks, like I said, with these 5 strips, I did not want a double row of the different colored squares, so I'm going to begin next with a square in the middle there, the cream square in the middle, and then the long strip, and then another with the square in the center. And I'll continue putting my quilt together. Rather than making it in quilt squares, I will be sewing my quilt together in long columns. Eventually, I may find a use for this stack that has the white or the cream squares on each end, but at this point, I'm just using the other stacks. So I thought I can use these on the outside of my quilt later, but right now, this is what my quilt looks like. These are my strips here on my design wall, and I'm going to start sewing these all together. Now that I have the first 5 strips together, I'm going to begin the design with the top of that cross shape. And like I said, I'll be sewing my strips together in a long row. These strips were fun to sew together. I did not do a lot of thinking as I was going along, and I did not count how many of these cross blocks I would get. It was kind of an adventure to find out how many I would be able to accumulate with all of these strips. So I began with 3 cross designs in each column, and when I was done, I ended up with 4 columns of 5 of those crosses. I still have some more strips of squares and these leftover quilting pieces, so I may get my little quilt here to be a little bit bigger. Right now it measures about 40 by 45. It's a good size for a lap quilt, but I may make it just a little bit bigger. I really love the scrappiness of this quilt, and it's always very satisfying to finish a quilt top that has been languishing in a cupboard, and this one is just so beautiful. In my last video, I made a block just like I'm showing today to go with my friendly sampler, and I mentioned that I did want to explore making this block with scraps. So that's what I'm doing today. I pulled out a lot of strips. They're all different sizes. I have a bucket with strips that I collect after making quilts, and there are quite a few widths here, some 2 inches up to probably 3 inches. And I'm going to sew some together and try to get a width that is 7 inches or just a little bit more. With these strips here, I used 4 strips, and all of the blocks will probably have a different amount of strips to get to that 7 inches. And I was very surprised to see that when I went to cut my 7-inch squares, this little piece of fabric, this strip set, was almost exactly 7 inches. Get my 7-inch block, I did need strips that were at least 15 inches long. That gave me an inch of wiggle room. 14 inches, of course, would be exactly 7 plus 7, but I like to have just a little extra, so maybe even 14 and a half would work, because I did want to cut off the end after everything was together. I wanted to give myself a straight edge and then cut those 7-inch blocks. For my block today, I chose this really light blue fabric for my background, and I'm cutting my squares in half diagonally, and I wanted to make sure that I cut the same direction. So I did cut my strip sets first and then my background squares, and it was mentioned yesterday that I could have put my squares together and drawn that pencil line and then put a seam on both sides of the pencil line, and I could have done that. This was just visually easier for me to cut them first so that I would make sure that I was cutting the same direction on both of my strip sets. And I alternated those triangles, and I am trying to be very careful with these triangles because everything is now cut on the bias, and bias tends to stretch. So I just tried not to handle my pieces too much, and I tried not to pull and tug at all. And after getting it all laid out, I sewed my triangles together to make some squares. After pressing all of my now half square triangle squares, I trimmed them all to 6.5 inches. This is a really fun block that's using up a lot of scraps. With my scrap colors, I was trying to focus on blues and greens, a little bit of just a light brown, and I'm going to make a few more, and then at the end of the video I'll show you a little mock-up of what a quilt using these blocks might look like. Here's what a quilt might look like using these scrappy pinwheel blocks, and I'm going to make some more, and before you know it, I will have a quilt. Today I'm putting a quilt together that I received unfinished in the mail. My quilty surprise arrived this week in a box from Kathy, and she sent me 3 unfinished projects and also a little project for a doll. The first project I wanted to share about included all these beautiful, what I want to call 30s reproduction fabrics, and a lot of the blocks were almost complete, but not quite. So these had, even the pins were still in there, and Kathy shared with me that this is an unfinished project that she purchased about 3 years ago. So I took these blocks right over to my machine. The pins were all ready in there, and all I had to do was finish up the seams on a few of these quilt blocks. These quilt blocks were so easy to put together. They were almost complete. All I had to do was that one seam on all of these blocks, and I wanted to get all these blocks together and find out how big of a quilt I had so far. When I had all my blocks together, I found that I had 22 blocks and I needed 3 more blocks to fill in the gap there, and there was plenty of fabric. This block uses squares that are 6.5 inches, and then you add a strip that's 6.5 by 3.5, and last of all, you add another strip, a longer strip that's 3.5 by 9.5. A nice big block, a very simple block, and so I only needed 3 more, and that's what I'm making right here. After getting all of my blocks complete, I ended up with 5 rows of 5 blocks, and I just tried to mix up the colors a little bit. This unfinished quilt also came with some strips, so I didn't want to leave those out, and I wanted my quilt top to get a little bigger, so I started inserting strips into each row. I did not add them every other one in every row. Sometimes I would put 2 strips together, but each row has 5 blocks and 4 strips. And I kind of mixed it up. I just thought it was more interesting to have those strips and blocks mixed up a little bit. This quilt top is really beautiful with all those pretty fabrics. The last thing I need to do is to put my rows together, pinning at some of the seams. I'm not pinning at every seam. Of course, all of the seams aren't coming together just because of the way that I put my rows together. So I'll add some pins and I'll sew my rows together, and before you know it, I will have a quilt top. This beautiful quilt top is all complete now. I do have more fabric. I may get this quilt top to be just a little bit bigger, but I used all of those quilt blocks that were almost done. And here's a glimpse of my husband's garden. I really love this quilt, and I'm dreaming about how I can make it just a little bit bigger. There's plenty of fabric in that wonderful box that came in the mail, and I look forward to figuring out what I'm going to do next. Thank you, Kathy, for this special project. Last time I was sewing with you, I made a very tiny quilt using 1-inch strips for my dollhouse, and I wondered if I could use that same technique, strips and cutting and flipping, to make another quilt. My blocks are, I think right here is one of the blocks. It would be the same as this with 6 strips, but look at the size difference between 1 inch and 2.5 inches. So I'm going to show you how I made this quilt. Let's get started. Here's that tiny quilt that I made in the last video for the dollhouse using those 1-inch strips, and it came out super cute. I did wonder how it would be to use that same technique using 2.5-inch strips. So I went to my stash and I pulled out this first fabric, and that's going to kind of inspire my color choices as I choose fabric to cut my 2.5-inch strips. I'm cutting my yardage, the width of fabric, 2.5 inches, and for each block I am cutting 6 strips. With those 6 strips, I was able to get about 2.5 blocks. So I made 2 blocks and then I had some leftover strips, and I'll show you in a minute how I used those leftover pieces to make my blocks. Here is my first set of strips, and I did not worry about the placement of my strips, but in future blocks I did decide that alternating the strips with the light and dark fabrics made for a better quilt block. I pressed all of the seams in one direction so that when I cut these into strips, those seams will nestle together really nicely. I lined up that strip set on my cutting mat here, and I'm going to be cutting my little strips in 2.5-inch segments. And after you cut a few, quite frequently you do need to trim the edge. For some reason it starts to get off kilter there, and so once in a while right here I'm going to cut that edge off and make it nice and straight. I'm kind of using my cutting mat to line things up nice and straight. And just like that little mini quilt I made for my dollhouse, I flipped the strip sets so that they're going opposite directions. And as you can see, my outside squares are all light colored. That's why I think in the future blocks I decided I would try to alternate darks and lights. At this point in my quilt, I wasn't sure I really liked these colors together, wasn't sure how this quilt was going to turn out. I will say when it was all done, I really liked this mix of colors, but it took me making quite a few blocks to feel comfortable with how this was going to turn out. Here is a block using some of the leftover strip sets. Like I said, I was able to get 2 blocks from each set of 6 strips, and these are some of the leftovers. So I did mix them up, and once this was placed in the quilt, you could not really find it. I think it worked out just fine to have this sort of scrappy block mixed in with the blocks that had more order to them. It was at this point when I realized I think I'm going to really like this quilt. I had 3 rows made, and I need 4 more quilt blocks, and here they are. Here is my quilt top before I put it all together. I think this quilt top is really beautiful. It's about 47 inches square, and I'm glad I proceeded with those colors I wasn't too sure about, because I think it's really beautiful. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.